opens the path for the queen and bishop, immediately fighting for central space and developing initiative. Developing the knight to f6 immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for potential kingside expansion, keeping options open. Asserting central space and opening diagonal lines for queenside development. Preparing a fianchetto allows black to challenge white's central pawns and gain long-term diagonal influence. Developing the knight to c3 now reinforces the d4 pawn and prepares for kingside castling, offering white solid central control and piece harmony. Boldly challenging the center, this pawn thrust ignites immediate central friction and opens lines for unleashed piece activity. Sacrificing this pawn opens lines for piece development and challenges black's central grip. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight immediately challenges the center and opens the d-file, setting up dynamic play. Seizing central space now, white boldly advances the e-pawn, challenging black's knight and dictating the early game's dynamic. Sacrificing the knight on c3 opens a diagonal for your king's bishop and creates a passed pawn potential, though it temporarily cedes central influence. The pawn chain now offers a broad control of the central squares, but it comes at the cost of creating a permanent hole on d3 and a slightly less flexible pawn structure for the queen side. This creates intriguing imbalances to exploit. Embracing the fianchetto, black activates their bishop to a long diagonal, aiming to pressure white's center and prepare for castling, a sound development choice that harmonizes with their knight's earlier retreat. Solidifying the center with piece development, white aims to build a robust pawn structure and prepare for kingside castling, while maintaining pressure on black's potential queenside expansion. Challenging white's central pawn structure immediately creates dynamic play and seeks to disrupt white's seemingly solid setup by opening lines. Developing the knight to f3 solidifies the kingside and prepares for castling, also creating a crucial outpost on f3 should the central tension dissipate. Instantly challenging white's central pawn structure, this queen sortie aggressively seeks to disrupt white's harmony and exploit the pawn gap on the queen side. Initiating central pressure with the queen redirects attacking potential toward the queen side, aiming to exploit black's slightly exposed king and potentially open lines against him. Developing the knight to c6 brings more pressure to the center and prepares for potential pawn pushes or piece activity. Harnessing the open file, white immediately pressures black's queenside structure, aiming to exploit the doubled pawns and potentially disrupt their developing harmony. This maneuver is designed to increase the strain on black's queenside, forcing a defensive reaction and potentially opening new avenues for attack. The rook's new posting on b1 signifies a proactive approach to territorial control, a stark contrast to passive waiting. A preventative measure against a potential knight outpost or bishop battery, though it does cede a crucial central square and potentially weakens the queenside pawn structure for future breakthroughs. Aimed at solidifying control over the c-file, this piece repositions to challenge black's influence and prepare for potential advances, potentially setting up a pawn lever later. Black finally confronts the central pawn tension, deciding to release it and simplify. This exchange immediately clarifies the pawn structure, paving the way for potential rook activity on the now open c-file for white. For black, the immediate consequence is the relinquishing of central space, potentially allowing white's pieces greater influence. The dark-squared bishop on g7 now faces a somewhat less obstructed diagonal, a minor positional compensation for the central concessions. It's a practical decision, prioritizing simplification over maintaining the complex central struggle. Opening the c-file offers immediate pressure, but relinquishes the central pawn chain's integrity. Consider how black can now exploit the compromised pawn structure. A sudden queen trade initiated, simplifying the position amidst the pawn structure's peculiarities on the queen side, potentially setting up an earlier endgame where white's doubled c-pawns might become a target. Relocating the monarch secures an open file for the rook and prepares for queenside activity, addressing potential pawn weaknesses while simultaneously initiating a transition towards an endgame scenario where king activity becomes paramount. Embracing chaos, Black ignites the queenside, attempting to disrupt white's central pawn structure and open lines for active pieces, though it risks exposing their own king to the newly awakened central files. Pushing the pawn to e5 creates a significant outpost for white's kingside pieces and immediately restricts black's knight's potential squares. This forward march aims to seize space and gain a positional advantage by cramping black's development, especially on the kingside where the fianchettoed bishop might feel hemmed in. A timely castling solidifies the monarch's safety behind a newly formed pawn shield, preparing to connect the rooks and potentially activate them on open files as the middle game evolves, while simultaneously challenging white's ambitious pawn advance, which has, admittedly, created some structural weaknesses that black may exploit later. The bishop leaps forward, initiating a tactical skirmish by forcing the opponent's king to reveal its new, less secure dwelling and potentially disrupting black's developing pieces. Nail down that central outpost for your knight, creating a more secure home for your pieces and preparing for potential pawn advances. A vital consolidation of white's regal protector, aiming to solidify the king's sanctuary and prepare for future skirmishes by connecting the remaining rooks. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, this square offers it better scope and prepares for potential breakthroughs along the central files. Initiating a kingside pawn storm here attempts to exploit black's somewhat passive piece development and the potential weakness of the f7 pawn. White aims to gain space and perhaps create attacking chances against the castled king, though this aggressive expansion does come with the risk of overextension if black can effectively counterattack in the center or on the queen side. Instigating pressure along the open c-file becomes paramount for black, as the rook now eyes the d4 pawn and can potentially disrupt white's pawn structure should the opportunity arise. Initiating the transfer of the bishop to a more active diagonal, anticipating a potential pawn push on the kingside. Safeguarding the kingside pawn chain is the immediate priority, preventing any potential infiltration by white's bishop or knights along the now weakened diagonal. Shifting the bishop to the open diagonal creates a significant positional squeeze, aiming to exploit the slight awkwardness of black's kingside pawn structure. Shifting the monarch towards the kingside, the black king seeks refuge and potentially greater activity, abandoning the d7 square and signaling an intention to participate more actively in the looming battle. Activating the rook on the g-file, this decision signals white's intent to contest the open file and potentially initiate a kingside pawn storm, aiming to exploit black's slightly exposed monarch after the prior king move. Black aims to activate their rook and potentially challenge the d-file, while simultaneously preparing for a potential pawn push on the kingside or a maneuver of the other rook to the c-file. This move signals an intention to increase piece activity and challenge white's control of the central dark squares, hinting at a more dynamic middle game approach. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside aims to shatter black's defensive setup and exploit the momentarily exposed monarch, but it risks creating weaknesses that can be surgically targeted later. The knight's repositioning to e7 aims to shore up the central pawn weaknesses and potentially eye the kingside, but it surrenders control of a critical central square and allows white to consolidate their space advantage, potentially paving the way for a kingside pawn storm or a more comfortable endgame. Opening the g-file, white immediately challenges black's kingside pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses and aiming to exploit the open lines for his rooks. The pawn thrust **h5** opens a dynamic diagonal for black's bishop and aims to establish a more robust kingside pawn structure against white's aggressive pawn storm. By creating this blockade, black seeks to quell white's immediate attacking prospects on the kingside and perhaps prepare for a counterplay on the queenside or central expansion. This move, however, does commit the king's shelter and invites further pawn exchanges that could weaken the pawn chain later. Securing that queenside outpost creates an immediate thorn in black's side, forcing them to address the potential infiltration along the b-file and preventing easy development for their bishop on c8. This maneuver strategically clamps down on black's kingside space, limiting their reactive pawn pushes and aiming to seize the initiative by restricting black's options. The bishop now eyes the e6 pawn, a potential weak point if black isn't careful with their pawn structure. Black wisely redirects their rook to the open file, preparing to challenge white's spatial advantage and possibly disrupt the coordination of white's pieces. Asserting control over the long diagonal, this placement of the bishop aims to eye black's weakened kingside, a strategic focal point now that the open files are becoming contested. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially aiming towards the kingside, seems logical, but consider the immediate threat of the white rook on the open c-file. Perhaps consolidating the pawn structure or reinforcing the center before embarking on such offensive maneuvers would provide greater stability, especially with white's potentially encroaching pawns. Liberating the c-file now opens crucial attacking avenues for white's rook to penetrate black's territory, potentially targeting weaknesses around the king or creating imbalances that can be exploited in the ensuing strategic battle. Reclaiming the open file is paramount, forcing the exchange of powerful rooks and simplifying the position towards a more manageable endgame scenario where black's bishop pair might still hold some sway. Striking the bishop on e7 creates an open diagonal for the queen and forces a trade of minor pieces, simplifying the position and reducing black's attacking potential. With this recapture, black solidifies the pawn structure and frees the king for potential activity, though the bishop exchange simplifies the position considerably, potentially favoring the side with more active pieces. Establishing dominion over the central files becomes paramount as the rook finds its optimal post on the open d-file, aiming to harass the enemy king and potentially infiltrate the queenside should opportunities arise. Demanding the king's attention with a timely check is a bold gambit, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially gain tempo or dictate white's response in a tense position. Shifting the king to a more active square, this maneuver prepares for potential pawn advances on the kingside or a safer retreat if the central tension escalates, while also clearing the d-file for future piece deployment. Injecting a dynamic presence into the center, this rook maneuver aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and exploit the newly opened c-file, potentially setting up a queenside pawn advance or a repositioning of forces to pressure the weakened white king. The knight boldly advances to the center, aiming to establish a strong outpost and potentially support a pawn push on the kingside, while also keeping an eye on the vulnerable dark squares around black's king. Unleashing a surprising rook maneuver, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened kingside by harassing the monarch's defenders. Repositioning the bishop here aims to defend the vulnerable f2 pawn and potentially contest the d-file, a key communication channel for black's rook. Snatching that rook looks tempting, but it leaves your king far too exposed, a juicy target for white's advancing pawns and a potentially open central file. Sacrificing material for king's safety is almost always a poor trade, especially when it doesn't lead to immediate tactical compensation. Snapping back the bishop initiates a material exchange, simplifying the position and directly confronting the doubled pawns that have been a persistent thorn in white's side. Seizing the open file with the rook dramatically shifts the balance, transforming a static pawn structure into a dynamic advantage as the queens depart. Recapturing the bishop with the knight initiates a more open structure, preparing to contest the now available c-file for potential piece activation. The black rook launches a daring raid down the open file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create endgame complications by forcing the king to move again. The king, now exposed on the kingside after the pawn storm subsided, must retreat to the relative safety of the second rank, centralizing itself to participate in the defense or prepare for potential pawn pushes. The exchange of rooks resolves the immediate tension on the d-file, simplifying the position and leading into an endgame where black's passed pawn on the h-file becomes a significant dynamic factor, though white's knight has excellent prospects of reaching a central outpost. The white king, having navigated the dangers of the center and the open files, now cautiously ventures into the territory of pawns, preparing to support its troops and potentially participate in the coming material struggle with an active role. The king, no longer shielded by pawns, is now a vulnerable target on the open board, compelling it to seek safety within its own weakened territory. King relocation signals a desire to escape the pawn weakness on the king side, aiming for a more secure square as the material dwindles and a simpler endgame beckons. The black king, having abandoned its protective pawn shield, now ventures towards the center, aiming to solidify its presence and potentially assist its remaining pieces. The white king embarks on a daring central journey, a bold maneuver to reactivate its dormant potential and join the fight for positional advantage amidst the fragmented pawn structure. Shifting the monarch towards the king side now marshals the king as an active participant in the ensuing pawn maneuvering, a critical requirement as the board simplifies. Repositioning the monarch to the king side offers better shelter and prepares for potential pawn advances, while the rooks remain passively placed. The bishop aggressively seeks open diagonals, threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure and create mating nets. Initiating a knight repositioning, aiming to solidify control over central squares and potentially threaten the opponent's advanced bishop outpost, while simultaneously preparing for a more active role in the ensuing middle game skirmishes. Unleashing a decisive check, the bishop pivots to the open diagonal, aiming to disrupt the white king's precarious sanctuary and capitalize on the exposed squares surrounding it. The king, now exposed by this advance, immediately seeks refuge from the diagonal threat, a calculated risk in this tense positional struggle. The capture of the bishop simplifies the position, creating an unbalanced pawn structure where black has an isolated pawn on the queen side, while white's king might find itself exposed in the center as the game progresses towards an endgame. The knight's journey to g6 seizes control of a crucial central outpost, creating a potent attacking spearhead aimed directly at black's vulnerable king. The black king, exposed and adrift, becomes the focal point as it attempts to escape the prying eyes of the white knight. Its desperate journey towards the queen side will prove a perilous one, potentially leading to its isolation and a swift mating net. Gaining space on the king side with the pawn push offers a clear objective, though it also potentially weakens the pawn chain's integrity. Consolidating the bishop onto the back rank is a prudent step, eyeing potential discoveries and bolstering the defense of the king, which now finds itself rather exposed on the king side. The knight's redeployment to f8 aims to solidify the kingside defense and prepare for a potential pawn push, but it allows black's bishop a freer hand on the a3-f8 diagonal. Seizing the open file with the pawn creates immediate pressure, potentially disrupting white's rook coordination and aiming to activate the isolated queen's pawn for queenside counterplay. The monarch's relocation to a more secure outpost is a prudent sidestep from the immediate pawn skirmish, aiming to consolidate defensive positioning against potential discovered attacks while keeping an eye on the central squares. Developing the passed pawn's advance is a crucial objective now, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for the bishop. The king bravely advances to support the pawn push, a bold maneuver aiming to solidify white's central presence and create potential outpost opportunities for the knight. Seizing the initiative, black creates a dangerous passed pawn by pushing the h-pawn forward, forcing the white king to reveal its position and potentially opening lines for attack. Seeking shelter for the king, white scurries it back towards its own pawn chain, aiming to consolidate the queenside pressure. Embracing the opportunity to advance the passed pawn, this thrust aims to disrupt white's king's safety and create immediate threats. Clearing the path opens a critical diagonal for your rook and aims to disrupt black's bishop activity on the queenside. The pawn advances, widening the path for its brethren to march forward, creating a dynamic pawn chain that now threatens to overwhelm white's defenses on the queenside. Finally, the knight finds its outpost on d7, a crucial square to stifle black's advancing pawns and potentially support a kingside initiative should the opportunity arise. Accepting the pawn at d4, a pragmatic choice to stabilize the pawn structure, sacrifices tempo and allows white's knight to reposition with decisive consequences. Returning the knight to its starting square, f8, is a pragmatic decision, prioritizing its safety and regrouping for potential defensive duties or a repositioning to a more active square later in this pawn-heavy endgame. Committing the king to such an exposed position is a daring maneuver, sacrificing central influence for potential dynamism. The knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to disrupt black's advanced pawn chain and create attacking possibilities on the kingside, while simultaneously defending against potential immediate threats to white's own king. The bishop now finds a more active square, eyeing the kingside potential and preparing to support the advancing pawns, though it sacrifices a certain passivity for potential counterplay. Probing for weaknesses on the queen side, white steers the knight toward the nascent b4 square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially exploit the weak c3 pawn. The monarch ventures into the center, seeking to become an active participant in the ensuing skirmish, potentially aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure or offer support to the advancing pawns. Averting immediate collapse, the knight repositions to a vital outpost, seeking to disrupt black's advancing pawn chain and defend the weakened king's sector. Focusing on the endgame transition, this move aims to connect the bishop and the pawn chain on the kingside, creating a more cohesive defensive structure. The idea is to prevent white from easily exploiting the isolated d-pawn and to prepare for potential counterplay by activating the bishop to support the advancing pawns. Reclaiming the central outpost is paramount, aiming to suppress black's burgeoning queenside initiative and prevent any further positional incursions. The black king, having ventured out for a moment's excitement, now faces the daunting task of finding safety amidst white's active pieces. The knight's journey to b7 aims to restrict the bishop's influence and prepare for potential queenside infiltration, eyeing the now vulnerable c5 square. Unleashing the bishop to e3 aims to regain some initiative, seeking to exploit the weak pawn on f4 if white's knight vacates it, or potentially to create mating threats along the a2-g8 diagonal.